Salutations! I see you've winged your way over to this presentation. This is Multivariate Analysis, Module 1, a bird's eye view, where we take a quick overview of such analyses. I'm Dr. Mark Williamson for the DaCCoTA project at the University of North Dakota. So let's dig into this. What is multivariate analysis anyways? Well, there's several definitions and they cover such a wide range of methods, it's sometimes hard to boil it down. But here are a couple good ones. One definition is the multiple dependent variables resulting in one outcome. That is, you might be familiar in something like multiple regression with multiple x variables, also known as predictor variables, but these ones have specifically multiple dependent variables as well, so multiple y variables. Another definition is statistical modules that have two or more dependent or outcome variables, so very similar to the first one. An even more concise and enlightening terminology from another source is summed up in the word matrices. That rather than thinking of individual variables and comparing it to other individual variables, you're looking at vectors, so like one-dimensional matrices compared to another. And you'll see that there's a lot of truth to that phrase carries a lot of water. So there are, however, some confusions when trying to define this. First of all, some sources use multivariate analysis interchangeably with multivariable analyses. So how you would think about this normally is that sort of single variable analysis would be you have a y and you have an x. Multivariable is like you have a single y and multiple x's. And then multivariate, you have multiple y's, so like a matrix of y's, and then a matrix of x's. Here when we say multivariate, we'll specifically be looking at multiple y's or similar. Other confusions is sometimes multivariate analysis includes, some definitions use Anova and logistic regression, other things that I wouldn't normally consider multivariate. And then finally, the term, just in general, multivariate regression can be also thrown around wildly, not clearly denoting what it's meant by it. So again, reprising, we're going to kind of take this schema as simple regression, as an example, is single response, single predictor. Multiple regression is single response and multiple predictor, and multivariate regression is multiple responses and multiple predictors. And that's when we specifically mean by multivariate regression. So taking all this in together, I'm going to sort of boil it down to my working definition for what multivariate analysis is. In this green box here is that it is multiple dependent variables that defines it, or other such complicated structures as ordination or nonlinearity. So that kind of captures it, because sometimes there are these multivariate techniques, it's not clearly obvious that there are multiple different variables, so I throw these other two in here. So it's not perfect, but I think that's good enough for our purposes here as we traverse farther. So as we kind of saw a little bit last time, it's sort of hard to classify not only multivariate analysis in general, but the different types. I'm going to just go through a by no means exhausted overview of some classifications and see how they're wanting. So here's an example here where they did split things out, starting with things like whether it's interdependence or dependence, and you get things out. Of course, you can see things like logistic regression, which I wouldn't typically call multivariate, but it's going on here, Anova and Manova by themselves over here. So this is a little bit to be wanting. So looking at another one, we again see a lot of times they start with dependence or interdependence, and you get a lot of these interesting things here, but by no means all the things we want. Again, here's another way of looking at it, where you're looking at gradient analysis, you're looking at the types of models, the approach, the type of approaches, and you get some more here, but again, doesn't capture everything. Here's yet another way, more on the machine kind of learning, whether it's regression or classification, supervised, unsupervised, linear, nonlinear, etc. Here's yet another one. here's yet another one. So, and none of these can be simply like corresponding to each other or mashed together to form a uniform whole. That's just not the case. So instead, we'll be taking a little bit different approach of classification. This is our classification landscape that I've come up with. I've divided these things into 6 different groups. Regression and Anova extensions, that seem kind of a general cohesive group. Canonical Analysis, dimensional reduction, what I'm calling grouping methods, then simultaneous and structural equations, and finally time-based methods. And they break out like this. And these are sort of the subgroupings within them. This is, again, by no means everything or maybe perfectly distributed, because dimensional reduction, for example, goes into a lot of these things, but I kind of consider these as like primarily why you use them. Anyways, hopefully this is useful, and now let's go through each of these 6 kind of broad categories in a little more detail. Okay, let's look at the structure and uses of our first category, regression and Anova extensions. So let's start by looking at Anova and Mancova. These are multivariate analysis of variance and covariance. They're extensions of Anova and Ancova, only with multiple y variables, so pretty straightforward. So a 2-way Anova example, you now have more than one dependent variable. And for 2-way, that means you have 2 factors, 2 independent variables. Mancova, very similar, but instead of another factor here, you have a covariate. You include that to count for it and to reduce noise. Another very simple is multivariate linear regression, extension of linear regression, but now we have multiple y variables. So if we wanted to kind of doctor this up and instead sort of show linear regression, it's just multivariate linear regression. Instead of another factor here, instead of factors, these would be like numerical things like grade, point average, or so forth. Okay, let's move on to support vector machines. So if multivariate linear regression is essentially a linear regression, this extends it into nonlinearity. So that's where we get that nonlinearity sort of in the broad definition I had. So this is a class of machine learning algorithms, also with the supervised learning model, and it's pretty useful for doing nonlinear things. Here's just an example to conceptualize why you might want nonlinearity. Maybe you want to distinguish between 2 groups here. Linearly, you can do it like this, but if you have 2 groups like this, which are kind of clear to your eye, but you can't draw a linear line, this would be a nonlinear decision. So it's not exactly what is going on here, but that's conceptually why you might want nonlinearity. And this is sort of what the model schematic kind of looks like. You have these input variables, so your x variables, and at least here we're looking at just one y variable, but then you have this sort of hidden layer of things going on underneath before you get the outcome. A very similar topic, again, in sort of the machine learning canon or whatever you want to call it, very similar, but now it's more closely resembles how brain processes. Again, it looks kind of like this. In this example, there's a bunch of inputs, different hidden layers, and then these output layers. These would we'd probably call our y variables. So these are 2 different ways of sort of machine learning here. And then finally, we have this thing called conjoint analysis. It's not used very much in, say, like the hard sciences, but it's essentially an extension of Domo variable regression, and it's used a lot in survey-based analyses, and it helps extract consumer preferences. And there's a lot of different kinds. So for example, this example here on phones, it turns out that price here was one of the most important factors in choosing a new phone. All right, next let's settle on to a canonical analysis. The 4 we'll be looking at here is canonical correlation, linear discriminant, redundancy, and canonical correspondence analyses. And these all fall under canonical analysis, as in canonical, just think here like generalized, just how you can have like a generalized linear mixed model and like a general linear model. The generalized is is more flexible, can cover more components. So really a lot of these, what's going on here for the most part is you're comparing two classes of matrices, essentially combining the effects of ordination and regression. So if you have an ordination alone, that's something like principal component analysis. You have just like one matrix of variables that you want to do stuff with. If you have regression, you usually have a y variable and then a matrix or like a group of x variables. But then, or canonical analysis combines the two, where you usually have a y and an x matrix. Now, with the first one, however, this canonical correlation, it's what's called symmetrical. So instead of thinking of y and x as like usually you think y is caused by x, there's this one-sidedness. We don't have any such sort of assumptions with canonical correlation. They're symmetric, as in, so we usually call it like u and v, not implying any specific relationship or direction we're looking at. And then it's also linear. And so really you're trying to figure out the orientation that maximizes correlation between the two variables. So here's one example of what it looks like. You have one set of variables over here, maybe call that u and call this v, this other set, and you're trying to maximize the correlation between the two. Here's yet another sort of more general thing where you have your x's, your y's, though not to imply causation, and you have your canonical variable set u, canonical variable set v, and then you look at the linear correlation between that. So with that, let's take a look at linear discriminant analysis, which is a different beast. For example, it's non-symmetric, as the other two are, because you actually interested in y and trying to like usually predict y using x. So y here is now a class of objects. So maybe like, you think of categorical, so like maybe it's A, B, C, different groups or something. This is going to be essentially an extension of multinomial regression, but with sort of the ordination tacked on. It's good for trying to like predict things. So next we have two very similar techniques, redundancy and canonical correspondence. They're both non-symmetric, so x and y matter. However, the difference is one's a linear model, one's a unimodal model, so it doesn't assume linearity, and then the distances are different. So really they're, again, related to multivariate regression, both ordination tacked on, as we kind of see here. And so here's one of those classifications. We see that what distinguishes the two is whether they're linear or unimodal. So with all that put into place here, I have this nice little classification chart that I put together to sort of distinguish between them. So is it symmetric? Well, yes. Well, then that's going to be the canonical correlation. If not, ask whether the y variable is categorical. If yes, linear discriminant analysis. If not, what's the distances? So if they're Euclidean, that's going to be redundancy. And if they're chi-squared, canonical correspondence. You could just easily cross this out and had something like, linear question mark. And if it was linear, that's going to be redundancy. If it was non-linear, that was going to be canonical correspondence. And we'll get more into the difference between these in the third part of this module series. Okay, so let's take a little break here and reduce with dimensional reduction. So the first one we have here is a very important technique called factor analysis. So again, this is now the sort of interdependence where we're not so much looking at one matrix against another, but just sort of one matrix itself and see what we can do with it. And typically what we're actually trying to do here is reduce a bunch of variables into latent factors. So the idea here is maybe we have all sorts of variables and that's too much to deal with, and we'd like to really reduce down them to the sort of their underlying essence, what might be sort of causing them. And so the idea is like, well, maybe you have these bunch of variables here, but they're all really sort of measuring sort of this underlying sort of hard to measure thing. Like say maybe this is IQ and these were a bunch of like scores, and maybe this is like sociality or something, and this is a bunch of, I don't know, social metrics. And so that's what factor analysis is trying to boil down all this sort of information into more simpler form. And this can take the form of both exploratory, kind of looking at your data, and confirmatory, trying to confirm sort of schema. So then another type of dimensional reduction is principal components. Again, it comes to the idea of this ordination, which is really, when you say of ordination, sort of like the best way I can explain it is sort of stuffing multiple variables into less variables so you can fit it on one axis of a plot rather than multiple axes, if that makes any sense or is useful. And so really what it's doing is arranging data along gradients, so like axes, to simplify it. And the idea is to reduce dimensionality a lot of times so you can visualize it, but still provide most of the info from all those variables. And the idea would be that only highly correlated variables are together. So this is sort of like the opposite, in some ways, directionality of factor analysis. We have all these variables that we're going to stuff this way into a one axis, and then maybe all these variables into another axis. And what it typically looks like is something like this, where so this isn't a single variable on this axis, it's these sort of principal communities stuffed down this sort of information and usually into two axes. We can see here that these dots are our observations, and it turns out they're from different areas, and that these different variables will sort of be loaded or be related to these axes. For example, this primary axis, which has sort of captures the most information, all these sort of variables are sort of positively associated with, while auctions is negatively associated. Whereas for the second axis, these ones are negatively associated, and this one is kind of positively associated, and these are kind of negatively, but sort of the tilt, tilt kind of shows that these are kind of almost in between 1 and 2. The more that they're sort of tilted away from dead horizontal or dead vertical. So that's just a little bit of PCA. A very similar related topic, principal coordinates analysis. You just kind of add a little O there to distinguish them. It's another ordination. Again, arranges along gradients. And it represents distance between samples in low dimensional space. So very similar, but distances mean a little more, essentially. And then one reference notes that it's better for missing data or fewer individuals than like PCA. And so again, it looks pretty different. As far as I understand, it's not as typical to have those arrows. We can kind of see here that the idea on this here is the distance on the graph means distance between sort of relatedness. So this one is, much more distant related than say this one. And that sort of makes sense if we're trying to like sort of distinguish out different groups. And finally, we have correspondence analysis. It's again like PCA, but now we're using categorical rather than continuous data. So typically we have categories and then counts for each category. And so it'll use contingency tables. So a great example here, this was sort of like the distribution of chores done between husband and wife. And so there's sort of categories, there's wife, husband, jointly and alternating. And then these are the different chores. We can see that, for example, husbands tended to do most of the repairs, while like they sort of jointly tended to do the holidays, while the wife tended to do more of the meals, etc. And then some aren't close to either of the or any of the four as much, so they're kind of more disparate. Okay, so let's turn our attention to grouping methods. It's sort of a broad term or generic term, but I wanted to put these two specifically together, which is cluster analysis and recursive partitioning, because they're sort of inverses of each other. So cluster analysis is really trying to group sets of objects so each group is more similar to members than non-members. This actually turns out to be a pretty difficult computational problem. It's trying to replicate, be able to find patterns like humans can do pretty instinctively while looking at things. So here's an example here with 3 clusters where there's some sort of set of variables. A lot of times you can see this kind of comes from a similarity of like PCA, the dimensional reduction. So you're not plotting, you could plot an X and a Y variable, but it might also be a component analysis or something similar to that. And these are the different states by these different characteristics, and then we have 3 clusters here. There's a lot of different kinds, hierarchical k-means, etc. Each sort of clustering in a different sort of way. Now the inverse of that is recursive partitioning, where you're not so much clustering, but you're trying to separate out. So you want to create a decision tree to classify members of a population based on different variables. So each tree branch is like a yes/no. And this is part of a more general technique of just decision trees. And you can tweak them in many different ways. So a great example of this we see here is we have some sort of outcome which is either survived or died, and then based on sex, age, and I think sibling space, we try to predict whether an individual is going to survive or not. So this recursive partition a lot of times used in like medical diagnoses or outcomes, etc. Okay, we're going to take a stab here now at simultaneous and structural equations. I put them together here because they're related. So simultaneous equation modeling, there's a lot going on here, but it's really just a system of 2 or more linear simultaneous equations. And they have all specific terminology here, like endogenous and exogenous. We don't really need to go into that. But essentially, exogenous are essentially their version of independent variables, while endogenous is dependent. So therefore, exogenous are influenced by exogenous and not the other way around. Now, if you have a complete model where you have endogenous equals the number of equations, you essentially get our next thing, which is a structural equation model. That's why we have them together. And it turns out if you have multiple endogenous variables, so they're essentially your y variables again, if you only have reduced to 1, you're really just down to multiple linear regression. So again, getting into structural equation modeling, it's a combination essentially of factor analysis and regression. The idea here is that you have a bunch of observed variables, so these boxes, and then that underlie these latent factors, sort of unobservable, that are typically shown in circles. And you want to impute relationships between these latent factors and then from these observable variables. And there's a lot of different types. This is sort of a broad class of things. We can have things like path analysis, partial least squares modeling, etc. So that's kind of what we have here. And we're not going to cover these too much more because I do have shown some examples of structural equations in my linear regression module, and you should be able to see the link to that if you want more information. It's also in the description below. Okay, let's wrap up here with some time-based. So the 2 we're going to cover here is vectoral autoregression and principal response curves. So vectoral autoregression, extension of univariate autoregression. So looking at some sort of variable, some sort of series over time. And you want to, with the multivariate component, is you're looking at multiple quantities over time. So you're typically looking at 2 different series. You can see here, want to see how these relate. And so, yeah, when one time series may influence the other, that's the biggest thing. Not so much that, the 2 are similar, that one might influence the other. And so each variable has a modeling change over time using past or lagged values, because the idea between these sort of autoregression models is that as time progresses, where this sort of model goes also depends on where it was before in the past. Now, another type of time thing here is this principal response curve. So this is more, a lot of times used in economics, the vector autoregression. This is used more in like ecology, where you want to do analysis treatment with repeated measures. So it's kind of an extension of repeated measures Anova, but now we have multiple y variables. And this helps correct for temporal trends, where our controls sort of being the baseline. And some places call this a special kind of redundancy analysis. We're not going to go into the details. I'm going to just wave my hands on that and just have you believe me. And the big selling point with this is, though, you can summarize and plot the results more interpretably than a biplot. So this is typically what these sort of outcomes look like. there can be a control treatment, and these different lines indicate different treatments. So I think these are different areas. So these are different areas where like the gray line is the control area. And across the x-axis, that's time progression, and the y-axis is sort of this combined a bunch of these y variables, usually ecological sort of abundance variables is pretty typical. And so you can see the changes there. So it's kind of, some say is more intuitive than a pie plot, but I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so let's dip into a couple examples here before we close out here. In later ones, we'll be looking at R exclusively, but I'll show it in R, SAS, and SPSS just to show that you can do it in all of them. So in R here, we're going to start out here with just a little bit of PCA, Principal Components Analysis. So I'm going to use the empty cars. I'm going to just remove the categorical variables. I'll run PCA with PR comp, scale them, and center them, and then here's a summary. And so there's going to be a bunch of principal component analysis, and then what's really helpful a lot of times is this proportionate variance, how much variance each one explains. Usually we only want the first 2 or 3. It turns out the first 2 actually combined cumulatively show about 85% of the variation. So one by itself is over half, the other is about a quarter. And then we can plot this with autoplot. We can see our axes here and then our different variables. We see that, for example, cycle is very positively associated with the first axis, while miles per gallon is very negatively. None is like really greatly for the second one, but gear and car are a little bit closer. And then now, moving on here, let's do a really quick factor analysis. So we're going to use factor analysis. We're going to let's just try 3 factors, do different things here. We're going to print. This is what we get. And it looks like with one factor, we get about almost half. Another one, we get about a third, and then less than that. So together we have about 87% cumulatively. And then we're going to plot it. And then so this is what we kind of get here. And if we kind of draw the factors, it looks like there's a factor here. Quarter mile second is its own factor, and kind of these ones over here. So not too bad. This is more exploratory factor analysis. All right, looking at SAS here, we're going to do some clustering. So we're going to use proc modulus to cluster. And we actually, the nice thing about this is you can cluster from various sizes. So we're going to look at 3 different radiuses. And when we spit that out, here's radius 5. It actually turns out 14 clusters. Radius 10, 2. And then radius 25, only 1. So there's a summary here. None of these were great because if you know anything about the iris dataset, we know there's actually 3 different species. It would be nice if we found 3 clusters. But the radius of 10 seems to be the best here. So here's the unclustered data. We're going by length and width because that's what we put here on the scatter plot here. Obviously, this has other data than just the x and the y, but we'll just put that here for now. And then here is examples of cluster data, because using the out data set here. So for the first one, we see there's like a bunch of 1s here, so this is 1 cluster, and then 2s, but then there's a bunch of these other smaller clusters by these other numbers up to 14. Now if we go to R10, we can really see here a lot clearer. I'm going to just zoop. We see, as we would do with our eyes, yeah, these all look like they're 1 cluster, and then this whole thing looks like another cluster. But then, of course, if we go out too far, they all turn to 1 big glommy cluster. So there we go for SAS. Finally, we'll load out SPSS. We'll do some Anova. So we got just a data set here. We'll take a look at the data in a little more second. We'll go to Analyze, Generalized Linear Model, Multivariate. You can do different things here, but we're going to do a Anova. So we have our fixed factors. That's going to be our group. And then our dependent variables. So we have this useful metric, difficulty metric, and importance metric. We're going to run that. We're also going to do a post hoc test, just kind of like in Anova, you do post hoc test, so you do goeth Manova. And so then here's the thing we get out. There's a couple different metrics we can look at, but it looks like in general, so the intercept, but we want the group because that's our y variable, or sorry, our x variable. Looks like the Pilley's trace doesn't find it significant, but the other ones do. So we're gonna move forward for now. If none of this was significant, you just stop and be like, okay, there's nothing there. But we're gonna go in here for now. And again, there's a lot going on here. We just want to look at group. Now we're separating out by the different y variables. So these are all the y variables. Useful, difficult, importance. It turns out none of these are significant. So at this point, we will stop. But in case one of these was significant, I'm just going to show you how we go on. If we did really go on, we go here. We could look at things, each of these y variable groups, or y variables by that grouping factor. There is 1, 2, 3 groups, and we could look at significance. Of course, unsurprisingly, none of these are significant because we didn't find significance higher up. So we wouldn't do a post hoc test normally, but just to be exasperatingly thorough, we'll do that here. Okay, so let's conclude here. We found that multivariate analysis is a series of advanced methods that typically feature multiple predictor y variables. And then ordination, nonlinearity, repeated measures, those are also pretty common structures. And a lot of the use for these, you can simplify your data, you can explore your data, you can of course do hypothesis testing. And I group them into sort of 6 broad categories to conceptualize them. So thanks for joining me. Tune in next time for a more detailed look at multivariate analysis. We'll be in our second module, Leaves and Trees. Before you go here, please take a 5-minute assessment, 5-question assessment. And then if you notice, I had a bunch of bracketed numbers. Those are all my references. They were too big to fit here at the end, so I have this document. You can get all those citations. This is certainly not a exhaustive explanation of everything. A lot of these things I just scratched the surface just because they're complicated, or I only know the surface, so you can go here for much more details by people who know this much more than I do. So, as always in these modules, this is DaCCoTA is supported by the NIH, so please cite us if you find this useful. All right, thank you and good night.